Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Erik Karlsson trade, but from a different perspective than I have taken in the past. When it came to my video discussing the Karlsson trade a couple of weeks back, I obviously primarily focused on the trade and my disagreement with it, the fact that I thought the Sharks could have gotten more value for Erik Karlsson had they retained more salary on that contract, the fact that they didn't really get all that much draft capital, and they definitely didn't get really any prospects to speak of, and so I more or less actually glossed over what the return actually was, with it being Jan Rutta, Mike Hoffman, and Mikael Granlund, 3 NHL players that I found that the Sharks didn't really need, and so I didn't really talk about them all that much. And the fact is that now, with sort of the past being the past, we cannot change what has happened. There is no do-overs. The Sharks and us Sharks fans need to adapt with what the Sharks did indeed get, and I haven't really done justice to the 3 players that they did pick up. I briefly mentioned Rutta in my defensive pairings video, and I briefly mentioned the 2 forwards in my power play unit video, but I haven't really discussed them at length, what they've done in the past and what they might be able to bring to the San Jose Sharks coming into this next season. So let's indeed start with Jan Rutta, who was, of course, on the Pittsburgh Penguins last season, but prior to that was with the Tampa Bay Lightning during their dynasty years, won a couple of Stanley Cups with them, as well as a Stanley Cup Finals loss to the Colorado Avalanche. And while Jan Rutta was, of course, not a huge part of that team, when you think of the Lightning, you think Stamkos, Kucherov, Hedman, Vasilevsky, he was still a solid part who played on that third defensive pairing for the Lightning and got a very solid 14 to 15 minutes of ice time per night on average over those sets of seasons. And Rutta, that third defensive pairing, you might not think it's particularly important. It's usually one of the afterthoughts of teams, especially in the playoffs, where you might be more willing to ride your top guys more than having to rely on your bottom 6 or bottom pairing players. But us Sharks fans should definitely be very, very aware of how important that third defensive pairing can really be. If we take a look back at the 2016 Stanley Cup Finals, the Sharks were on a roll moving through the Western Conference, ended up against the Pittsburgh Penguins in that final round, and they really exposed a weakness of the San Jose Sharks. The Penguins were not only a very fast team, but a heavily depth forward group as well. They had Phil Kessel, a 90-point player, on their third line. And so while Burns and Paul Martin as a top pairing definitely held up pretty well, Vlasic and Braun also very, very good as a second pairing, the third pairing of Brendan Dillon and Roman Polak were just absolutely abused. Pretty much every single time that they stepped on the ice, you knew the Sharks were going to be taking a long stint in the defensive zone, and the Penguins made the Sharks pay time and time again. This was before Brendan Dillon had really come into his own as a solid defenseman in the league. Roman Polak, always pretty much more of a depth kind of guy, and they just were not nearly good enough for the Sharks to actually win games constantly. Were they the major reason the Sharks lost? Perhaps not, but they were definitely a big part of it. And Jan Rutta shows just how well a solid third defensive pairing can do. It allows you to rest your top guys more than having to just go with 4 defensemen for the entirety of the playoffs, which is not usually a recipe for success. And they can eat up minutes against perhaps even some pretty good players. Having said all that, is that really what the Sharks need going into this season? Well, not exactly. Rutta is a solid bottom pairing defenseman who is joining a defensive core filled with other bottom pairing defensemen, sometimes not even all that solid, and so it's very possible that with the experience and the championship pedigree that he has, he may very well be thrusted onto the first defensive pairing facing off against top competition of opposing teams. And while I've mentioned Rutta is very solid in the role that he had with the Lightning, he probably isn't as solid in a first pairing role, so it's very possible that he'll be exposed, so to speak, with the San Jose Sharks because they don't really have anyone better to fill that particular role, and Rutta hasn't really done that in his not super long but still decently long NHL career, so I'm not exactly sure how well this is going to work out. If the Sharks would have picked up a player like Rutta 3 years from now, 5 years from now, when they were looking to be competitive, I would be, wow, this is a very nice pickup, but right now, it's just slightly awkward. Then we take ourselves to Mike Hoffman, a forward who was a very, very effective sniper goal scorer with the Ottawa Senators in the earlier parts of his career. Of course, connected very well with Erik Karlsson, at least on the ice. Of course, there are rumors of things off the ice, but that's not really the topic of this video. On the ice, they had some pretty solid chemistry, and of course, many will remember that amazing goal of Karlsson flipping that puck high up in the air for the pass to Mike Hoffman breakaway goal against the Boston Bruins, a highlight of the playoffs in that particular year. But Hoffman, ever since really leaving the Ottawa Senators, he had a couple of very strong years with the Florida Panthers, even broke the 30-goal barrier and the 70-point barrier. But once leaving the Panthers, he had stints with the St. Louis Blues and the Montreal Canadiens, where he was last season, and things kind of took a downturn. And the problem with Mike Hoffman is that he is an exceptionally one-dimensional player. He is solely offense and pretty heavily invested into actually scoring goals. And so if he's not actually able to do that, he's not really providing a lot of value to the team that he is on. He kind of is reminiscent of a player like Kevin Labanc, but perhaps even more extreme. Labanc, a very solid player offensively, which allows him to get some decent looks in the top six, but defensively in his own zone is not particularly responsible, which not only gets him bumped down in the lineup, perhaps even gets him healthy scratched. And Hoffman is like that times 10. Very effective in the offensive zone, can score goals very easily, especially on the power play, but when it actually comes to playing a two-way game, which you need to do if you want to be a top six forward, he's not good at that at all. Probably one of the most not good defensive players, to say the least, in the entire league. I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. So it's going to be very interesting to see what David Quinn does with Mike Hoffman going into next season. You would think the primary sort of role that you would want to fit him in is something like on a third line where he gets like top power play units, a power play specialist, kind of like what the Sharks were trying to do with Kevin Labanc maybe a couple of years ago. But as we know, David Quinn not happy with what Kevin Labanc was doing last season and healthy scratched him multiple games. And so Hoffman, a player very, very similar to Labanc, could end up in a type of situation exactly like that. But here's the issue. Labanc has been on the San Jose Sharks for a few years, doesn't really have that sort of age, that experience factor, so it's pretty easy, I would say, from an off-ice perspective for David Quinn to healthy scratch him. But Hoffman, definitely much more of a veteran, has a lot of seasons under his belt at the NHL level, so it's more difficult off-ice, so to speak, to actually kind of say, hey, Hoffman, we're going to give you the healthy scratch here tonight because you haven't been playing well. So it'll be interesting to watch exactly how he has handled. He could be a decent player for the San Jose Sharks, but he's kind of like an independent kind of guy and isn't really going to be helpful for the San Jose Sharks moving forward. But that does bring us to the final player acquired in this trade, which was Mikael Granlund, who is pretty much the exact opposite of the type of player that Mike Hoffman is. Hoffman, purely offense on the goal-scoring side usually, while Mikael Granlund is purely offense, I guess, but mostly on the playmaking side. In fact, he is a pure playmaker, one that the Sharks really haven't seen since, I would say, Joe Thornton. Now, of course, Granlund is not of the same caliber of Thornton, not even close, but the Sharks really haven't had that type of playmaking forward since Joe Thornton had arrived. And Granlund, back in his prime with the Minnesota Wild, was one of the most underrated playmakers in the entire league, in my opinion, being able to put up close to 70 points in some of those seasons with the Minnesota Wild. And you might be thinking, well, close to 70 points, that's not amazing. It's good, but not amazing. But this was during a time in the NHL where scoring was much lower than it is these days. Of course, the usual example that people love to use is that back in the 2015 season, Jamie Benn won the Art Ross, which is for most points in the league, with 85 points. Meanwhile, his 85 points of that season would put him tied for 22nd in the league in this past year. Connor McDavid almost doubled up on the amount of points that Ben had when he won that Art Ross. And so a close to 70-point player from, those years is pretty much equivalent to like a point per game player these days, just with how much offense has increased over these past couple of seasons. And while Granlund, of course, is not at that prime, he still certainly has some good, solid game left in him. It was not necessarily last year, but the year before that, where he put up a very solid 60-point campaign with the Nashville Predators. And though he wasn't really given much of the time of day with the Pittsburgh Penguins as well as the Nashville Predators this season, he still ended up with a solid 41 points in these 79 games. But what's most interesting when it comes to Granlund is something that differs from Mike Hoffman as well, is that Granlund, being the playmaker, will allow the other players on his line to shine and to really experience some solid hockey, which is very good for some of the Sharks' younger players who might be jumping into the lineup or be playing in the lineup for the Sharks in this upcoming season. I imagine Granlund could perhaps fit in onto the third line, and if it were last season, that third line would be filled with Evgeny Svechnikov and Nick Bonino, where he would basically be passing to cardboard cutouts of NHL players. But this season, with the increased forward depth, Granlund could end up passing to players like Kevin Labanc, Philip Zadina, William Eklund, perhaps even going further in the rookie category and with like players like Thomas Bordeleau or Danil Gushin. And this could really allow those players to shine and really experience some solid play. Remember, it was Kevin Labanc's best season in the NHL when he was playing on that third line with Joe Thornton. And while I said Granlund paled in comparison to what Joe Thornton was in his prime, Granlund might not necessarily be that much worse than what Joe Thornton was right at the end of his career almost, at the age of like 39 or 40. So this could end up being a pretty effective player for the San Jose Sharks, and probably the only of these three players who I feel as though could have a positive impact in the Sharks past the time than they are actually still on the team. Both Hoffman and Rutta are likely to just sort of be blips on the radar for the San Jose Sharks, and in 5 years you'll kind of just think back and be like, remember that time where we got Mike Hoffman on the team? That was a little weird. But with Mikael Granlund, he definitely could help the development of some of these players, and with him having 2 years left on his contract, which is close to immovable, meaning he very well might be on the team for the next 2 years, that could actually be pretty helpful for the Sharks moving forward. So generally, while I of course am still not a big fan at all of the Erik Karlsson trade, of the three players that the Sharks got, it does help the forward group, it does help shore up the right-handed defensive group as well, and a player like Mikael Granlund could also help the development of some of the younger Sharks players if given the opportunity for that. And so I guess we got to make the best of a bad situation. Class dismissed.